April 17th, 1975. Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia. For 5 years, the city had been besieged, a swollen, desperate island of 2 million people, refugees from a brutal civil war. That morning the war ended. The Khmer Rouge, the communist guerrillas, marched into the city. They were figures of strange discipline, teenagers dressed in black pajamas, wearing sandals made of tires, carrying AK-47s. The city, starving but relieved, erupted in celebration. They greeted the soldiers as liberators. They waved white flags. They believed the nightmare was over. The celebration lasted 3 hours. Then the soldiers, their faces blank and emotionless, lifted their rifles. They did not shout. They did not celebrate. They began to move through the streets, methodically door to door. The order was simple and absolute. Leave the city. Immediately. You have 15 minutes. Do not ask questions. The Americans are going to bomb. It was a lie. There was no bombing. The order was the objective. Panic swept the streets. The liberation became an evacuation, a death march. 2 million people were forced onto the roads at gunpoint. The sick were pushed from their hospital beds, their IV drips still attached. The dying were left on the streets. Mothers gave birth on the roadside. The city of Phnom Penh, a metropolis of 2 million, was completely emptied in 72 hours. It became a silent, concrete tomb. This was not an act of war. It was the first day of a monstrous social experiment. This was year zero. The architect of this utopia was a man hidden in shadow. He was known only by the name Brother Number One. The world would later come to know him as Pol Pot. The great brutal irony of the Khmer Rouge is that its leadership was not born from the rice paddies they claimed to worship. They were not peasants. They were the privileged, educated, urban elite. Pol Pot's real name was Saloth Sar. He was born into a well-off family, his cousin a royal consort. He was educated in the finest French Catholic schools in Phnom Penh. He was described as charming, mediocre, and unremarkable. In 1949, he received the ultimate prize for a colonial subject, a government scholarship to study in Paris. He was sent to study radio electronics. He failed. In the cafes and student clubs of Paris, Saloth Sar found a different kind of education. He did not read electronics manuals. He read Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. He fell in with a clique of radicalized, leftist Cambodian students, men who would later become his co-conspirators like Ieng Sari and Khieu Samphan. They were consumed by a romantic, radical idea. They believed Cambodian society was fatally corrupt, poisoned by Western capitalism, by urban life, and by intellectualism. Pol Pot developed his own twisted, unique branch of communism. He was inspired by Mao's Cultural Revolution, but he took it to a terrifying extreme. He believed the true, pure proletariat was not the factory worker. It was the illiterate, unspoiled peasant. He developed a profound, self-loathing hatred for the very things that had created him: cities, education, and intellectuals. In his mind, the city was a parasite. The farmer was the host. To save the nation, the parasite had to be killed. He returned to Cambodia in 1953, his scholarship revoked. He did not return as an engineer. He returned as a revolutionary. For the next decade, he lived a double life. By day, he was Monsieur Sar, a charming, popular, and gentle history teacher at a private school in Phnom Penh. By night, he was Pol Pot, a secret party organizer, meticulously building the framework for his revolution. In 1963, pursued by the secret police, he fled to the jungles of northern Cambodia, and for the next 12 years, he disappeared. In the wilderness, he forged his army. He recruited from the poorest, most isolated, and most illiterate peasant tribes. He indoctrinated them in his new ideology, a cult of personality built around an organization known only as Angkar. Angkar, the organization, it was the all-seeing, all-knowing entity. It had no face. It had no name. Angkar was the mother and the father. Angkar was the eye of God. And its soldiers, many of them children, were taught that absolute obedience to Angkar was the only virtue. Mercy was a bourgeois weakness. This was the army that marched into Phnom Penh on April 17, 1975. They were not liberators. They were the surgeons of a new society. And their first act was to amputate the cities. The evacuation of the cities was not a panicked decision. It was step one in a detailed blueprint to re-engineer an entire country. The Khmer Rouge declared that Cambodian history was over. Society was to be reset. Year zero was declared. To achieve this, Angkar divided the new population. First, the base people, Ngui Ku, the poor rural peasants. They were considered the pure revolutionary class. Second, the new people, Ngui Moi, also called the April 17th people. These were the 2 million evacuees from the cities. They were considered tainted, bourgeois, and inherently corrupt. They were the enemy class, destined for slavery and extermination. With the population divided, the blueprint was enacted. First, the abolition of the economy. The concept of money was deemed capitalist and corrupt. Pol Pot ordered the National Bank of Cambodia to be physically blown up. Currency was scattered in the streets, worthless. Markets were outlawed. From this day forward, there would be no commerce. There would only be work. Second, the abolition of knowledge. The new society, this perfect agrarian state, had no need for intellectuals. They were seen as a threat, a remnant of the old world. The regime began its great purge. To have worn glasses was a death sentence. To speak a foreign language was a death sentence. To have soft hands was a death sentence. Doctors, teachers, lawyers, engineers, artists, monks, and even high school students were hunted down. Cambodia became a country where the only skill allowed was knowing how to swing a hoe. Third, the abolition of religion. Angkar was to be the only god. Pol Pot declared Cambodia an atheist state. Buddhism, the faith of 90% of the population, was outlawed. Monasteries, some of them centuries old, were desecrated. They were turned into prisons, torture centers, or pigsties. Monks were forcibly disrobed and put to work in the fields. Those who resisted were executed. Fourth, and most terrifying, the abolition of the family. This was Pol Pot's ultimate goal. The final loyalty that competed with Angkar was the love of one's family. Families were systematically broken apart. Husbands were separated from wives, parents from children. All communal eating was mandated. Children were taken to be raised by the state, indoctrinated to be the eyes and ears of Angkar. They were encouraged and rewarded for reporting on their own parents. Private emotion was forbidden. Love was forbidden. Grief was forbidden. The only permitted emotion was devotion to be the brother number one. With this blueprint, the entire nation of 7 million people was turned into a single massive concentration camp. The Khmer Rouge had successfully created the Empire of Death. This empire was not built on stone or gold, it was built on skulls. The mechanism to achieve this utopia was systematic, bureaucratic, and chillingly efficient. The murder of 2 million people in 364 days required two primary tools. The first, and largest, was the killing fields. The 2 million new people, the urban evacuees, were now slaves. They were marched into the countryside and forced to work on massive, delusional agricultural projects. They were building dams and irrigation canals with no technical knowledge, often using only their hands. The workday was 16 to 18 hours. The reward was a single bowl of watery rice porridge, or bobo, per day. This was the primary method of execution, death by overwork and starvation. People collapsed and died in the fields where they stood. They died of malaria, of dysentery, of exhaustion. This was a deliberate policy. The Khmer Rouge slogan was, "To keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss." But for those who did not die fast enough, or who showed the slightest sign of intellectualism or dissent, there was the second tool, direct execution. These executions were designed to be brutal and, above all, cheap. Bullets were considered a waste of resources. The killing fields, the name given to the thousands of mass graves across the country, were places of blunt force trauma. The victims were forced to dig their own graves. Then they were beaten to death. The executioners used shovels, pickaxes, sharpened bamboo sticks, and the iron axles from ox carts. Children and babies were often killed by being held by their legs and smashed against trees. They killed people for the smallest crimes, for complaining about the food, for mourning a dead relative, for foraging for a wild potato, or simply for having been a teacher in their past life. The regime's motto was, "Better to kill an innocent by mistake than to spare an enemy by mistake." The second great mechanism of terror was the prison system. The most infamous was a former high school in Phnom Penh, code-named S21. Today it is known as Tuol Sleng. If the killing fields were for mass disposal, S21 was for ideological purification. This was the regime's central torture and interrogation chamber. The regime, in its profound paranoia, was obsessed with finding enemies within. They believed the revolution was being undermined by spies. From the CIA, the KGB, and most of all from Vietnam, S21 was the factory designed to produce confessions to prove this paranoia was true. It was run by Comrade Dutch, a former math teacher. Like a true bureaucrat, Dutch ran his prison with meticulous, obsessive detail. New people were arrested and brought to S21, doctors, engineers, and teachers, but as the paranoia grew, the regime began to eat its own. Khmer Rouge soldiers and party officials accused of disloyalty were also sent here. They were chained to the floor of former classrooms. They were photographed, documented, and then systematically tortured until they confessed. The methods were medieval: waterboarding, electrocution, pulling out fingernails, being hung from gallows. The goal was not to get the truth. The goal was to get a confession that fit the regime's narrative. Prisoners would confess to being spies for the CIA, often implicating their entire families and networks, who would then be arrested and sent to S21 in turn. Once the confession was extracted, a document often running hundreds of pages, rewritten by the torturers, the prisoner's use was over. Out of the 16,000 to 20,000 people who entered the gates of S21, only 7 are known to have survived. The rest, their confessions neatly filed away, were trucked to a killing field just outside the city, Koyung Ek. There, they were bludgeoned to death and pushed into mass graves. An empire built on such self-destructive paranoia cannot last. By 1978, the monster had begun to eat itself. Pol Pot, consumed by his fear of enemies within, launched a series of bloody purges against his own party, especially in the eastern zone, bordering Vietnam. He accused his most loyal commanders of having Khmer bodies with Vietnamese minds. In his ultimate act of hubris and racial paranoia, Pol Pot declared Vietnam the historic enemy number one. He began launching savage cross-border raids into Vietnamese villages, massacring civilians. He had made a fatal mistake. He had provoked a battle-hardened, professional army that had just defeated the United States. On Christmas Day 1978, Vietnam had enough. They launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge, so effective at terrorizing its own unarmed citizens, completely collapsed in the face of a real army. The Angkar, the all-powerful organization, evaporated. In just 2 weeks, on January 7th, 1979, the Vietnamese army rolled into Phnom Penh. They had ended the 4-year nightmare. Pol Pot and the remnants of his regime fled back to the jungle, where they would wage a guerrilla war for another 2 decades, supported in a final act of geopolitical cynicism by both China and the United States, who saw them as a useful tool against Vietnam. The brutal truth of the Khmer Rouge is that it was not an empire of death by accident. It was an empire of death by design. It was not a descent into chaos. It was the logical, systematic, and horrific application of a diseased ideology. It was the brutal truth of what happens when intellectuals, detached from all humanity, gain the absolute power to turn their romantic, agrarian fantasies into a living hell. Pol Pot did not just want to rule Cambodia, he wanted to purify it, and the purification required the execution of history, the murder of knowledge, and the extermination of anyone who remembered what it was like to be human. The utopia of Year Zero was not a failed dream. It was a perfectly realized nightmare, an empire of silence, ruled by a teacher and built on a foundation of 2 million skulls.